The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm BillKashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. The Philadelphia Eagles' recent playoff run and Super Bowl victory has provided the national media with more fodder for criticizing the city of brotherly love and our sports fans. It all began, of course, in 1968 when Birds fans booed Santa and pelted him with snowballs at the season finale at Franklin Field. And, of course, the criticism continues to the present day. Our fans have a reputation for ugly behavior that ranges from booing future Hall of Fame performers to chasing them out of town with death threats. According to the mythology, even when our teams win championships, the fans are out of control, toppling cars in the streets, climbing streetlights, and more recently, during the Super Bowl parade, eating the droppings left by a police horse. Nor do we discriminate. We boo all our sports teams with the same vitriol. But how realistic is this negative stereotype? With us today to answer the question is Joe Vallee, co-author of the book, A Snowball's Chance, Philly Fires Back Against the National Media. Joe is also a co-founder of Philly to Philly.com, a Philadelphia sports website that reaches more than 2 million viewers. He can also be heard on KYW News Radio commercials. Welcome to the podcast, Joe.
Bill, thanks so much for having me. It's a great week to be a Philly sports fan.
Well, let's begin with the obvious question, Joe. Why does the national media paint us as classless lowlifes who are never satisfied with our teams and our players?
That's a fantastic question. It's a loaded question, and there's a lot of answers. I think what it comes down to, Bill, is the fact that, with the exception of a few Sundays ago, which I'm still basking in the glory in, we don't win a lot in Philadelphia. This isn't Titletown, USA. And when we do have good teams with high expectations or even no expectations, when we usually lose, and in usually the end with our teams we lose, it isn't pretty. It's usually heartbreaking. That's not to say other cities haven't experienced that, because Lord knows how many heartbreaking episodes the Chicago Cubs fans have had to deal with, and, of course, the Boston Red Sox with the curse of the Bambino. But all of those other cities have multiple titles from other teams. Of course, in Chicago, you had Michael Jordan and the Bulls. The Blackhawks with championships, one of them at the Flyers' expense, and the Celtics have 17 titles. New York, we can't even get started on those guys. And I said this in A Snowball's Chance. When you look at all the other major market cities, they're always consistently winning or have won multiple titles with multiple dynasties. We don't have that in Philadelphia. There's no moniker that they can give us other than the fact that we lose a lot, and we have lost a lot. And that comes out through means of behavior that isn't always necessary or exemplary, in my opinion. We're not perfect. We're no angels. There's a lot of venom and bitterness in a lot of those boos. And I'm not saying a lot of that is right, or I'm not justifying a lot of it, because there's idiots out there, and they don't necessarily reflect the behavior of the entire fan base. But our reputation, Bill, in my opinion, would probably be a lot better if the teams won more. I know it sounds simple, but the media has to pin something on us. And that's why the Snowball's nonsense has gone on for as long as it has. The Cubs have the Billy Goat curse, and the Red Sox, of course, as I said, they had the curse of the Bambino. There's nothing in Philly that's quote-unquote lovable about us, God forbid. And, hey, look, I was at the NFC Championship game outside Lincoln Financial Field, and there were some obnoxious Viking fans there who were absolute jerks, who did pick fights with Eagle fans, and vice versa. I saw the other side of that as well. But I talked with a bunch of Viking fans who were nice as could be, and they just wanted to go to the game. But any other time when an incident happens in another city, it's always, it's an isolated problem, or that doesn't happen all the time. Well, in Philadelphia, it's the norm. Oh, you know those Philly fans, they did throw snowballs at Santa Claus. Well, a Giants fan was killed in the Dodger Stadium parking lot a couple years back. Dave Parker and Reggie Jackson, Parker being a borderline Hall of Famer and Reggie Jackson being a Hall of Famer, they had batteries tossed at them as well, and they weren't playing in Philadelphia when that happened. Tom Gambella from the Royals, the former first base coach, he was attacked on the field in Chicago. I can't recall that ever happening in Philadelphia. And how many blown calls have gone against our Philly sports teams historically? You know, nobody went after an umpire or anything to that nature. We're passionate, yes, and sometimes, unfortunately, the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime. Now, judging by some of those videos that people watched last week, there's reason to believe where people would think, oh, those fans are animals. But it doesn't constitute the entire fan base, and it definitely happens in other cities as well. And as far as the players go, best example I can give with that is Ryan Howard. If you're getting paid $125 million to hit a baseball and your team is struggling, you're going to get the brunt of it. And I think that's why Howard got booed more than a player like Jimmy Rollins or maybe Chase Utley did. And just as far as an example, I mean, we have players, anybody. I mean, I just put Ryan Howard in that bunch, but there's other players that have been here as well that have signed big contracts and never lived up to the expectations. You could say Nnamdi Asomugha from the Eagles is one of those players as well. And from the average Joe, no pun intended, living in the tri-state area, we're a blue-collar city. We appreciate the blood, sweat, and tears. And when we don't see that or we feel like someone isn't performing to these expectations, we get a little rowdy. And again, I think you can bring it back to the fact that we don't win a lot around here. And I think it really definitely always goes back to the fact that we just have a losing tradition with our teams. You know, what happened with the Eagles is more the exception than the rule. And as far as expectations go, that's one of many reasons why the Super Bowl title is so great. Because there were no Super Bowl expectations at the beginning of the year for the Philadelphia Eagles. I had the team finishing 9-7, maybe 10 wins, and a shot at the NFC East, depending on how Dallas was going to do. And I keep shaking my head in regards to the irony that our last two titles in this town came rather unexpectedly. Everybody knew the Phillies had a good team in 2008, but they were considered contenders in the playoffs, certainly not favorites. The Cubs and Angels had better seasons and were favored more than the Phillies were. And as far as the Eagles are concerned, the team that finally won the Super Bowl, Bill, it wasn't a Ron Jaworski-led team or a Randall Cunningham-led squad with Buddy Ryan's tenacious defense or Donovan McNabb's teams with Andy Reid at the helm that were picked to go to the Super Bowl and sometimes even win. I find it hard to believe that anybody with a solid general knowledge of sports who doesn't have psychic powers predicting what happened with the Eagles in 2017. To me, they're like the 93 Phillies, 2001 Sixers, and 2010 Flyers who finished the job and won the title. They immediately, overnight, became one of Philly's all-time greatest and most beloved teams.
You bring up an important point about the curse of expectations. You're absolutely correct. I mean, in my lifetime, the championships I remember and the almost championships were the 1980 Phillies, the 1993 Phillies, the 2008 Phillies, the Sixers back in 1983, was it?
83, yeah.
And then again in 2003 or 2004, and now the Eagles. And every single time, none of those teams were favored. I mean, if you remember 1980, the 77 Phillies were a much better, well-rounded team than the 1980 Phillies, and those guys were given the ultimatum, deliver or we break you up. So part of the problem here is when Philadelphians expect, it almost never seems to happen. These championships come out of nowhere. And I can't help but feeling that, and being, a Phillies fan, I mean, that's the one team that I've really been with my entire life. The first year being 1964, and you know about expectations there. But, the problem there is, I can see it. I can see that the knee-jerk reaction is, if there's a way to blow it, the Philadelphia sports team is going to do it. And I can't help but feel that's just part of a wider inferiority complex that Philadelphia has being sandwiched between New York to the north and a football city like Washington and football baseball like Baltimore to the south. You know, I've lived in near Boston. I've lived in Washington, D.C. I've lived in London. And I can tell you, there is not the inferiority complex in any of those cities. And they do have their blue-collar elements. But for whatever reason, the national media just relates Philadelphia completely with blue-collar fans and blue-collar behavior. And, you know, I think maybe to a degree we're vulnerable to that.
Oh, most definitely. I think that we have a bullseye on our backs, and unless some teams start winning more championships, Bill, I think it's always going to be the case. I mean, I do think, and it's not coincidental by any means, but I believe since the Snowball's chance has come out, there have been other incidents in other cities. I mentioned Dodger Stadium and the stabbing there in the parking lot being one of them. And then, of course, Brian Stowe, the Giants fan who was beaten into a coma by a Dodgers fan. That really shows that, you know what, Philly's rough, but I don't think we hold the championship title card in violent or even sometimes, unfortunately, deadly offenses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You just worry now with Doug Peterson's statement that playing into February is the new norm in Philadelphia, you know, especially when you just lost two key coaches, and, you know, that team will never be the same team again because players will move on, some will retire. I just get real uneasy when a coach or anybody makes that kind of statement, because then you have the curse of expectations, and no longer are you the underdog. Everything is expected of you. Joe, I want to go into specific incidents that you and your co-authors have brought out in A Snowball's Chance, because I think that you were spot on in identifying these things. And, of course, they begin with the December 1968 episode where Eagles fans in Franklin Field are booing Santa and pelting him with snowballs at the season finale. Can you give us the story behind there and then the reality of what happened?
Absolutely. First off, I really appreciate the comments. Everybody has really taken a wonderful liking to A Snowball's Chance, and it did really well when it was released. And, you know, we just wanted to make a statement, celebration of the Philadelphia fan, and maybe kind of twist the narrative towards the proper perspective that it should be, and I think we did that. December 1968. I think that's the modern-day reputation of the Philadelphia fan was forever cemented that day, I think. And I was in charge of writing the first chapter for the book, and I knew it had to start with Santa Claus. And I definitely knew we needed Frank Olivo. God bless him. He was such a wonderful man, and I was able to know him really well before he passed away, but I was able to get a hold of him, and I didn't know how he was going to react to me calling him and asking him if he could take part in this book, but he loved it. He was so great. He spent hours with me about this, and he really loved the way that it came out. Well, the Eagles, as you know, were a brutal football team in 1968, and Joe Kuharich was the head coach, and they didn't really like him a whole lot either. And if the Eagles, I believe if they lost the final game of the year, or one of the two final games of the year, they were going to land the number one pick in the draft, which turned out to be O.J. Simpson. And it was a miserable team. It was a miserable year, and there happened to be a blizzard that weekend near Atlantic City, I believe, where every year somebody dressed as Santa from the restaurant Zabers, which I remember it was a great place. My parents loved it out there. He usually came down from Atlantic City, that area, to go to the Eagles game, and he was the team Santa Claus. Well, there was a blizzard and he couldn't make it. Not only that, but the grounds crew or whoever was working that game failed to clean the seats. Well, as luck or not luck would have it, a gentleman named Frank Olivo was in the stands, and he always wore a Santa suit to the last home game of the year. And they saw him in the stands, and Eagles management or somebody there, PR, asked him to come down at halftime. Well, it was not a pretty sight. And Eagles fans started to take their frustrations out on good old St. Nick. Now, the narrative, the national narrative, Bill, is, the Santa suit was horrible, and he was stone drunk, and that's why they threw snowballs at him. And neither of that is true. I asked Frank about that. And Frank he came from a good Catholic family, and they went to church every Sunday, and right after church, they go right to the game. And he told me, he said, there was no time for drinking if I wanted. After church, boom, right in the car and right to the game. So that's not true. And he said, second off, the Santa suit was top of the line. I don't know, because there's very little footage of that, if any, of Frank. I mean, there's pictures here and there, but it's tough to decipher a 50-year-old photo. But Frank was not intoxicated. He was a guy that was simply in the wrong position at the wrong time, and Philadelphia fans were not feeling very Christmassy that day, if you will, and they took their frustrations out on him. And I think it's really as simple as that.
So the Santa suit, I mean, this was a ritual with him. He'd do it at the last game every year, so it was planned. Therefore, the Santa Claus suit wasn't makeshift. It was something that was substantial and legitimate.
Yes. I think otherwise, I don't think the Eagles would have picked him out of the crowd to do it unless there was no other Santa Claus there, which, of course, was definitely a possibility.
Makes sense. Okay, how about staying with the Eagles now? 1999, when the Eagles select Donovan McNabb, who had a wonderful year career at Syracuse, and then, took us to a Super Bowl in 2005. But, the fans wanted, I guess, who was it? Ricky Henderson?
Ricky Williams.
Oh, Ricky Williams, I'm sorry. Ricky Williams, and they get Donovan McNabb, and the Eagle fans start booing him right there when he's on stage. What's up with that?
Eagles fans wanted Ricky Williams because Angelo Cataldi from WIP wanted Ricky Williams. And I like Angelo. Angelo was a tremendous supporter of a Snowball's Chance. He had us on the radio, and he wrote the foreword to my other book that I wrote with Bill Elwingador Simmons, Snow on the Barbed Wire. He's been very supportive of me and my work. But Angelo will be the first one to tell you that he orchestrated all of that. And oddly enough, Bill, as you know, Philadelphia sports, whether it's trade or draft, have made some pretty bad decisions, and there's been some misfires there. But you can't argue that that's one that the Eagles got right. And you can say what you want about Donovan McNabb personally. He never really connected with the Philly fans. Yes, he came up short in Jacksonville, but statistically speaking, he's still the best Eagles quarterback in their history. Say what you want about Nick Foles. Yeah, he brought home the trophy. But McNabb did it for longer, and the Eagles had some pretty good teams with him.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn to the Phillies.
But he never got over it, though. That's another thing. Sure. He never got over the fans booing him.
I'm sure, and he's carrying that with him right now to the present day, it seems like. Turning to the Phillies, August 11th, 1999, J.D. Drew of the St. Louis Cardinals booed and pelted with batteries by Philly fans, which, by the way, seems to be a habit, because not only did Philly fans do that to Dick Don't Call Me Richie Allen when he was traded to St. Louis, they did it to Allen when he was still in Philadelphia back in the 1960s. So what's going on with this? Are Philly fans particularly vitriolic to the point where they're going to throw objects at players they don't like? What's the case with J.D. Drew?
Well, as far as Philly fans and objects, as I mentioned earlier, Dave Parker and Reggie Jackson were both the victims of that same issue, whether it was in the Bronx. I don't know where Dave Parker was. I know he was playing for the Pirates when that happened to him. So, again, not justifying stupid behavior, because throwing any projectile at a player is just absolutely, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. J.D. Drew, that was a long and arduous process trying to get him to come to the Phillies. As it turns out, they never were able to bring him to the Phillies, and then they drafted Pat Burrell. That is definitely a misfire on behalf of the Philly fans, and we emphasize that in the book. Now, that being said, there were 2 or 3 people out of close to 46,000 who did that, but that's all it takes. And we used to have an automobile business back in the day, Bill, and my dad always used to tell me, son, it takes one customer to paint a bad reputation and just totally ruin what you've developed and what you've built, and it takes a lot more good people to sing your praises. So then again, like I said, there were 2 out of 46,000, but there's no rhyme or reason for that. Did he, and from what I heard by some accounts, Cardinals players weren't too crazy about J.D. Drew either for his prima donna attitude and what he did. Certainly none of that was justified at all. I can see reasons why Philly fans are upset, but they should have expressed their anger in another way.
Now, I rather glibly made the reference to Dick Allen back in the 1960s, and that's when I started following baseball. And I remember being in Connie Mack Stadium and witnessing some of the unbelievably racist behavior of the Philly fans towards Allen, and it was racial. It was clearly racial. The epithets that were being yelled from the stands. Philadelphia was known as a very racist city, probably right up there with Boston, as those were the last 2 teams to integrate the Phillies in the National League and the Boston Red Sox in the American League. So that was clearly a different situation involving race. But the J.D. Drew, and obviously Dick Allen did not deserve that at all, especially with the numbers that he put up and the effort that he put out to win for the Phillies. And that's one thing, that Philadelphia fans, although, very few of those people I believe are still around, and if they are, they keep their thoughts to themselves. But that is one, area where the criticism of Philadelphia fans is deserved, albeit back in the 1960s. Allen was my first hero growing up. My second one was Mike Schmidt. And there's another incident here that I want to go into. I think one of the most fascinating events in Philadelphia sports history occurred when Schmidt was playing first base for the Phillies. He for a 2-year period, moved over from third base to make room for Rick Shue, who was a fantastic fielder, but nowhere near the hitter Schmidt was. So Schmidt moved over to first base for the 85 and I think 86 seasons. And in June of 1985, after criticizing the hometown fans in a Montreal newspaper article earlier in the season, the Phillies return home to Veterans Stadium. They're in second to last place in their division. They're playing the Cubs. Schmidt was mired in a 267 slump, and the fans were ready to boo the hell out of him when Dan Baker, the public address announcer, introduced him. Now remember, Schmidt at this point is at the tail end of his career. He had already led the Phillies to 2 pennants and a world championship. He had already won a slew of home run titles and 2 MVP awards, with a third one just a year away. He was a lock as a first ballot Hall of Famer. But when he runs out onto the field to take his position at first, he's wearing sunglasses and a wig. And I can remember this like it was yesterday because I was there for moral support. The fans were completely caught off guard. And honest to God, they were thrown into a momentary stupor. Schmidt was the last one announced, and you could hear this kind of grumbling almost building. And when he took a step out of the dugout, you could almost hear the buh coming out. And then all of a sudden, everybody stops. And the silence was deafening. You know, and the response was, who the hell was playing in Schmidt's position? You know, where was the slugger? We want to boo the living daylights out of him. And then suddenly the fans realized that the joke was on them. And instead of booing Schmitty, they gave him a standing ovation. Can you give the listeners some background on the love-hate relationship that the fans had with the greatest third baseman in baseball history?
You know what, Bill? I compare the relationship that Phillies fans had with Mike Schmidt for those years with the relationship that Eagles fans have with Donovan McNabb. Mm-hmm. Both Midwestern guys, both not one to always show their emotions. And I often wonder, Bill, and like you said, Schmidt was a lock for the Hall of Fame, so I know in retrospect he would be looked upon more fondly than Donovan McNabb, who's a borderline Hall of Famer, and I think a Super Bowl probably would have put him in the Hall of Fame. I don't think he's going to get in now. Mm-hmm. But I often wonder how Philly fans would look back on Mike Schmidt if he didn't win the World Series in 1980. I definitely see two parallels between the two. Now, when Schmidt comes back now, he gets the biggest reception in the house, except for, unfortunately, Darren Dalton passed away, and he won't be there this year for any of the alumni festivities. But Mike Schmidt now is loved and appreciated. And in 1985, as you know, the team was in decline. Most of the players had moved on. Gary Maddox, Steve Carlton, and Schmidt were probably the main three that were left from the glory years. Yet you had an influx of young players like Juan Samuel and Von Hayes. And the team never got off the right foot. And with the exception of 1986, when they won 86 games, the year Schmidt won his third MVP, the following year, it was never quite the same again. And it was just, I think Philly fans have always related more to a player like Larry Boa, who lined up right next to Schmidt for all those years, who scratched and clawed for everything, even his major league uniform, for God's sakes. And a guy like Brian Dawkins on the Eagles, who's just fiery. And Schmidt was Mr. Cool, Mr. Calm, Mr. Collected, and you never saw a whole lot of emotion out of him. He would throw a helmet every now and then. But, and a bat if he struck out, which he often did, in addition to the 548 home runs, of course. And he made that comment, like you said, they waited to publish that until closer to the end of the year when, like you said, the Phillies were really in a bind, second to last place. And I think that moment right then and there, and Larry Anderson says this, people want to see, whether it's in Philadelphia or Boston or Chicago, they want to see the human side of a player. And that incident right there, I think single-handedly, I'm not going to say it turned around the perception of Mike Schmidt, but it gave them, in my estimation, and if I'm off base, please correct me, you know what? He's all right. He kind of gets it. And I think they began to appreciate him even more and more. Then his 500th home run came, and he had a couple more productive seasons. That wasn't the best season in his career per se. Like you said, they moved into first base. The team was struggling. But I think right then and there, I think fans kind of softened their stance and appreciated really what they had. And I think another reason they were able to do that is because the glory years, I mean, they were over.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, and it leads me to a question about the fan bases of the various teams that I do want to get to. But and obviously with Mike Schmidt, I'm biased. He was, one of my two favorite players, in baseball growing up. And obviously I've done a lot of writing on him, and I've talked to a lot of people about him, and I find a divide among the Philadelphia fan base. I mean, there are those very vocal, outspoken, working class, if you will, fans that do want that emotion, and they want the players to exude that emotion. They want to be able to relate with them that way. But there's also, and I would call these the majority of Phillies fans, who suffer in silence when the team loses and rejoice when they win. But they are thinking fans, and they get Mike Schmidt, and felt terrible about the way he was treated because of the unbelievable ability and work ethic that he had. I mean, you know, the hitting, a lot of people think that comes naturally. The fielding came more naturally than the hitting did for Mike Schmidt. He worked on his hitting, and people didn't see that because of his demeanor. But I think the other thing about Schmidt is you see that he really is appreciated now that he comes back and he's doing those weekend broadcasts. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who really tune in on TV to listen to those broadcasts because they like his analysis. And he does have a wonderful sense of humor. But I do agree with you. I think, you know, the most outspoken of the Phillies fans, who we have called the Boo Birds, you know, for the reasons you mentioned, did not like him. But, you know, that leads me to my next question. Can we really say that the Philadelphia fan base is a uniform fan base? I mean, you know, you got the Flyer fans who are with their team, you know, win or lose, it seems like. You've got the Eagles fans who are unbelievable. I mean, just, yeah, they're great fans when you win, but they can be pretty obnoxious. And you know, let's admit it, alcohol brings a lot of bad feelings out, and that's how you keep yourself warm during the games. The Phillies fan base is, as I've said, I think it's split. And I think the majority are pretty well-behaved fans who understand the game and they're thinking fans. And then who knows what the Sixers get. But I see the fan bases of each team a little differently. Am I correct on that?
You're absolutely 100% correct, Bill. The Phillies, hey, look, I love all four teams. I'm a 4-for-4 guy. Like you, the Phillies were my team. I related the most to the Phillies. I lived and died with the Phillies my whole life. It is different. I think the clientele has changed a little bit and softened their stance a little bit because of the World Championship in 2008 and that run that they had during that time. The Eagles, you know what? Whether liquid courage fuels their fires and desires and their passion, whether it's warm or freezing, they always show up. You can't say Eagles fans don't show up. I mean, when they were 3-13 in 1998, everybody still came out to those games. Now, I find it really interesting because, as you know, in the decade of the early 2000s, the Eagles were the quote-unquote chosen team. They were going to be the ones that were going to break that title drought. They might even do it multiple times. Well, a funny thing happened in 2008. The Phillies, an organization that, gosh, the way it was run in the 1980s, I mean, that was like a junior country club. All of a sudden, they broke through, and they were the team to end this title drought. And I think for a short while, Philadelphia, it became a baseball town more than it became a football town. And it coincided with the fact that the Eagles came up short in another NFC championship game, and then they traded Donovan McNabb, and there were some down years when there were some great years for the Phillies. For that short while, I think the Phillies fans kind of took over the town. The Flyers, they've got a loyal fan base. I think that will be with them for as long as they want to be. And I can't really figure it out because they haven't won anything since 1975. The Sixers, like you said, it's a mixed bag because even when Dr. J and Moses Malone were on the team, they still weren't the toast of the town. Philadelphia has always really been known as more of a college basketball town. And then when they went through what they went through the last couple of years, I don't necessarily know if people, well, they did hate what was going on, but the way they felt about it, I don't think, you don't see many irate Sixers fans go booing at games. I think the team, despite their struggles, I think the fans kind of rallied around, quote unquote, the process. And I'm not going to say they made a game out of it, but they had no choice but just to be optimistic for what was possibly to come. And I think they're being rewarded now. And I have a 10-game plan with some friends of mine from Jersey, and we've probably gone, 5 out of the last 6 years we've had tickets. And this year, they point blank told us as we were getting the tickets, there's no guarantee if we're even going to get tickets. And we were loyal ticket holders, even though they're 10 games. So, you got a lot of people who are jumping on the bandwagon as well. So, yeah, it is a mixed bag. For the 4 teams in town, it is really interesting, the dynamic of the fan base. And I think you can be a fan of all 4, which a lot of people are, but I think you said the average consensus, maybe even stereotype of a fan, is exactly what you mentioned and described.
Yeah, it's interesting about the fandom and how there are, dare I say, most of the Philadelphia sports fans go all 4 teams. I don't know about the Flyers. I mean, they brought winning in the modern era, to our generation with those Stanley Cups in the 70s, those back-to-back Stanley Cups. But definitely it seems like you have, football, basketball, and baseball. Now, I will admit that I started following the Eagles when I was in elementary school, but they were so bad that I, didn't pay much attention to them again until Dick Vermeil came and turned the team around. And then after Vermeil left, I lost interest in them. And I lost for a number of years, the Kotite years and I even forget the coach that succeeded Kotite. And I really didn't even jump back on the bandwagon when Reed was there. Not even in 2004 when they had such a great season. But this team I really, really liked from the get-go. A lot of it was, yes, because of Carson Wentz and his he's got class, and he doesn't wear his feelings on his sleeve, but he comes across as an intelligent and good person. A lot of that deals with his religious beliefs, which, is neither here nor there to the Philadelphia sports fans. But if it's going to bring you a Super Bowl title, then who cares what his religious beliefs are? I mean, I think that's how most Philadelphia fans. And the same thing with Foles. I was a Foles guy. I mean, the first time around, and I was really pissed off when Chip Kelly got rid of him. I was really pissed off. But I like the composition of this team. I like the way that they, use that underdog status to go all the way. And if there is anything about faith in athletics, I think this team proved it, because they had faith when really, admittedly, a lot of us here in Philadelphia didn't. And you have to admit that.
Absolutely.
Especially the way we ended the regular season this year. But I guess my question here is, Philadelphia is a football town. I mean, there's no question about it. Even when the Phillies won the World Series in 2008, after October was over, it was, yeah, fine, great, we got a World Championship. Let's talk Eagles football. And that's November to the end of the season, and then just rolling over, into January. Everyone was talking football. And that really disturbed me. It really disturbed me. But Philadelphia is a football town. And having said that, does that mean that the national media projects these negative feelings because they are equating this unbridled passion of the Eagles fans to all the fan base?
Oh, yeah. I think they're definitely looping, even though they're specifically right now talking about Eagles fans. I think they think they're speaking for all of us. And it's not necessarily. It's interesting, Bill, what you said before, how the Eagles were so bad when you were growing up, and that's your first introduction to the team. Because when you look at the four Philly teams historically, which is the one that has the least baggage?
Wow. You tell me. I think that's a hard question because they all have tremendous baggage. I mean, maybe the Flyers more recently, but they started in '67, and then in the '70s they won back-to-back.
Exactly. So there was never any of the baggage. Yeah. Right? Yeah. It was never any of the, when I grew up they were horrible. You know? I mean, they were really a model franchise up until the late '80s, early '90s when they had that drought. So with that team, I think the clientele and the fan base might be a little different because you didn't get that. Oh, I was in Connie Mack Stadium, when John Boozer was on the mound, and in 1969 when the team was really struggling, and then Connie Mack closed, and then they were still bad when they moved into the vet, and the players that they had back then. I mean, and for me, it's the 1980s with Steve Jeltz at shortstop. You don't really have that with the Flyers. So I think that's another reason there. I mean, they have a tradition of winning. Now, granted, it was a tradition that started in the early years of their franchise, but that seemed to be I don't want to say translated, but it spans generations up to now. And out of all of the teams in Philadelphia right now, I would probably say that this year's Eagles will eventually probably be like the Flyers. If they can win another championship and keep some of those guys around for a number of years, I think they relate to this city next to the Broad Street Bullies probably more than any team in history. I don't think that's a stretch.
Here's the interesting thing about these Eagles. They now have 5 NFL titles. Obviously, this one's a Super Bowl title, and there's that division between NFL titles and Super Bowl titles. But, basically, when it's all said and done, they have 5 NFL titles. They weren't around in 1926, but their predecessors were the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, who took the 1926 NFL title. They won back-to-backs in, 48, 49. They won in 60, and now they've won this one. Now, the only other team before this time that had that kind of record, and I'm sure you've heard the joke, the Philadelphia Athletics are the most successful professional sports team in Philadelphia, and they haven't played a game in the city since 1954. Because they had the 9 pennants and the 5 world championships. Now, if
they had more money, they'd still be here.
That's true. We could have been the New York Yankees. We could have been.
Yep.
But Connie Mack it was poorly run from the 30s on, and that was that. But if you count the Yellow Jackets as, part of the Eagles organization, because that team eventually led into the Eagles, they've got their 5 NFL titles now. And I think what you're going to be seeing, and we're already seeing it right now, people are now forgetting about the 1960 Eagles. That's history. Those players are really now, sentenced to the past, and we're looking ahead. It's kind of what the Phillies did to the old Philadelphia Athletics when they moved out of the vet, because at least they used to honor the Athletics when they were there. Now, they really don't want to have anything to do with the Athletics. But that was a tremendous fan base, and talk about the unattractive behavior of the fans. That's not a new phenomenon. You had athletic fans who booed, and even worse, they brought tomatoes and eggs, and they throw it at the players. Way back in the day, So
sure.
Talk about those fans. They were unbelievable. And I would imagine that they weren't that much different than many of the other fans in other major league cities. But I can't help also believe that the modern reputation of the Philly fan is such a negative one because the local media, the sports writers who cover the teams, and the sports talk radio show hosts help to create some of the ugly incidents. I mean, don't you think that you know, if the writers and the talk show hosts were not as negative, that the fans wouldn't be as negative? Because face it, we don't have access to the fans anymore. You got to pay for access to the fans now. It's not like back in the 20s, 30s, and even the 60s when they lived in the same neighborhoods with us. So who was the liaison between the fans and the team? It's the sports writers and sports talk radio hosts. So to what degree do you think that reputation was really created in large part by the media in Philadelphia?
It's a really interesting dynamic there because when you're a caller and you call into the station, it's easy to get heated and passionate when you start discussing those teams. And I do think I'm not going to sit here and say that radio hosts promoted violence or, you know, they said, oh, get that J.D. Drew and whatnot. I do think in the advent of social media, I think this generation's fan is a little more tech savvy and a little more educated in that aspect because I will look on Facebook and look at articles that local sports publications will post after an Eagles win or during a bye week or the week before the Super Bowl. And some of them are absolutely ridiculous. And it's just clickbait. And it's just things to either, A, you're right, get fans riled or get them talking. And you hear some of them go on 5 paragraphs, no, blah, blah, blah. And then you hear some people say, come on, that's clickbait. Stop. Just stop doing this. Stop creating a situation when there is none. Just stop. So, you know, that's one dynamic that I see that's really, I guess over the last maybe 3 or 4 years, been a change there. But I think in general, Bill, the age of old school sports writers and controversy, for the most part, they've come and gone. I think things are way too glossy now because there's a lot more at stake. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but back in the day, I think there was less precaution taken when something came out about a player that maybe could have been potentially damaging or, you know, now you've got television stations owning teams and social media access that could be potentially revoked if something incredibly incriminating was brought to the forefront. I think there's a lot of red tape now, whereas back in the 70s, 80s, and mostly the 90s, there wasn't. These days, I find big stories usually leaked by TMZ Sports or a fan shooting a video of Riley Cooper yelling racial slurs that websites might publish, as opposed to the general sports talk radios, because I think there's more venues now as well, like podcasts, like other articles and blogs, and I think that there's other means besides talk radio, which I think personally has gone downhill in a lot of areas, and I think there's been a lot of educated fans who really don't listen to that anymore and decide to listen to people like us.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I mean, you're spot on. I mean, the reason I started this podcast is I just got tired of listening to WIP and the fan. I just got tired of it, and I wanted to have substance, and I wanted to hear substance, and I wanted to hear it from the people who are authorities, you know, in the areas that they've written books on, or the players themselves. The best podcasts that I hear these days are ones like yours and Wildfire Radio. Some of the broadcasts they have there, Mike Gilligan's podcast, U-Tooth Radio. You know, there's and Philly Press Box Radio with Jim and Bill. There's just a lot more venues where educated fans want to listen to points, like you said, without the screaming and without the yelling and all that nonsense. Joe, in the book you address the art of booing, which we in this city have elevated to an art form. What are some of the different kinds of boos that you've identified, and when are they used?
This was really the most fun chapter in the book, and a lot of people have told me they really enjoyed it, which I really appreciate. Well, there's a sarcastic boo. And this could apply to a reliever who's thrown 5 straight balls and then they throw a strike and people start clapping. There was the Billy Wagner and the radar gun. If he didn't hit 100 miles per hour, the fans would boo. He thought that they were booing him, which of course they weren't. There's the Alex Rodriguez boo or the Barry Bonds boo. When those players come into town, and when they came into town, you knew that they weren't going to get cheered. The Sidney Crosby boo, Michael Irvin rather. And then there's booing of local players. Like you said, we've booed our own. We've booed our own, and that could be because of a certain situation or just because the person isn't living up to their contract, or he flat out just doesn't get it. Because there are people around here who really, they're not built for Philadelphia. So there's players like that. Mm-hmm. And, like you said, there's someone like Mike Schmidt, who was the greatest third baseman of all time, and he said something that was a little off color to fans around here, and he was going to get booed, but he redeemed himself. There's a bad call. I mean, Lord knows we've been the victim of some of the worst calls in the history of sports. Bruce Fleming, Black Friday, 1977. Leon Stickle in the 1980 Stanley Cup Finals. Mm-hmm. There's booing an opposing team for beating your team in the playoffs. I mean, I was at Citizens Bank Park when the Cardinals beat the Phillies in the NLDS and Ryan Howard came crashing down on the ground. That was not a happy day for Philly fans. And you can boo because your team didn't execute. I interviewed Larry Bella in the book about that, and he said, I had to tell my players that they might not necessarily be booing you. They're booing the fact that the Phillies didn't score any runs when they really needed to. There's also the booing of a player who shows up or harms one of your team's players. Scott Stevens on Eric Lindros, for example, back in 2000 in the conference finals against the Devils. Or there's players like Jason Worth, who leave your team and words were exchanged and just bad blood develops. It's unfortunate that it happened, but there's players like that as well. So, and Terrell Owens. Terrell Owens is another one. Even though he had great success in Philadelphia and when he was there, I mean, he owned the town. The way he left was less than in favorable circumstances. So, there's that. And then there's the players that are just good. There's the Tom Brady's and the Emmitt Smiths that you're going to boo because they're good. Chipper Jones. I mean, we booed the heck out of him. So there's lots of different boos and I guess you can break them down. It's kind of hilarious in a way, but fans do boo for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Joe, do you think one pro sports team in our city gets booed more than the others? I mean, if there's different types of fans for each team, then there must be, one team that gets it less. I mean, offhand, I'd say probably the Flyers get booed less than the Phillies. I mean, do you see that dynamic at work, that one sports team gets booed more than the others?
Oh, yeah. I think you'd have to say the Phillies, Bill, mainly because they're the oldest team in the city. Yeah. And because they have a prolonged period of losing.
Right.
From 1984 to 1993, there wasn't a lot to cheer about. And like I said, the way the organization was run, it was pure embarrassment compared to how it was run with the Carpenter family. I know it was a different time and there wasn't free agency and whatnot, but it was still less than spectacular, let's put it that way, compared to even how things are run now. And even after 1993, this continued for another 7 years or so. I mean, those years, Bill, as you know, they were awful. Awful. And, Flyers fans have occasional bouts with booing, and the Sixers should have been booed worse than they were. But I think people rallied around the situation, like I said, more than a witch hunt with that team, as opposed to what you've seen sometimes with the Phillies, which, again, made it interesting to finally see the city become a baseball town for a little bit when they won in 2008. But, yeah, I'd say the Phillies. The Phillies are the whipping boy, for sure. And a lot of it's deserved.
Yeah, well, I have to agree with that because the club has not been run intelligently for so many years, definitely since Rudy Carpenter left. You have decisions that are made that are incomprehensible. They go, all the way to just traditional scouting and evaluation to now we've swung all the way over, it seems, to analytics. And, I realize that the Yankees just hired Aaron Boone, who doesn't have a lick of managerial experience, but he could work with the press because he was part of it, unlike Joe Girardi. Well, frankly, I think that's a stupid-ass move. But what do we have here in Philadelphia? A guy who has 1 year of managerial experience in the minor leagues. Granted, he speaks very well. He's articulate. He's a genius when it comes to analytics. But I don't know, how well he can evaluate what's in a player's heart. I mean, he seems to be that kind of player that, as a player, that the Philly fans would embrace because he gave it all. He was very positive and he was very energetic. But that doesn't necessarily translate, and the analytics don't necessarily translate in really understanding what's in a player's heart and in their soul, and how to use them in the various situations. I just don't see that. So I think they're taking a huge chance right now with that hire. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I eat my words on that. But I really think that you need a balance of the traditional evaluative methods and traditional baseball knowledge and knowing the players and analytics. And I just don't see this flip-flopping to extremes. I don't get it. I think it's more of the same.
You make a good point, and I'll reference your book, Almost a Dynasty. The Phillies from 2008 in that era, they should have won more championships, and some of it had to do with the mistakes management made holding on to the team for too long and issues in the minor league department with their scouting and whatnot. And Gabe Kapler, Bill, he's either going to be Doug Peterson or he's probably going to be Chip Kelly. I don't think there's going to be any in between. So pitchers and catchers start soon, so it's going to be really interesting to see where he goes with this. Like you said, it is a roll of the dice. It is an out-of-the-box hire, but maybe that's what they need.
Well, stay tuned on that one. Joe, what's the flip side? That is when one of the city's pro sports teams wins a championship like the Eagles just did, give us how the Philadelphia fans, the so-called boo birds, react to that because of their passion.
I think it dies down for a bit. And Brad Lidge did not have the year in 2009 that he had in 2008. But you wouldn't have known it from the fans in 2009. I mean, maybe near the end of the year when things got a little hazy, they started getting a little antsy and impatient. But I know from my perspective, when the Eagles lost the NFC Championship game to the Cardinals a couple months after the Phillies won, I mean, we were really disappointed, and we thought the same old, Rita McNabb, they can't get it done again. But after that, we were like, well, you know what? We won the World Series 2 months ago. It's cool, I mean, all right. It wasn't that bad. It does make things a little easier. And as bad as 2011 was with the Phillies when they should have won the whole thing again, at the end of the day, we can fall back and say, you know what, well, we did have, I mean, not for a while, but in retrospect, you know what, we did win in 2008. And the Flyers with Eric Lindros and the Sixers with Allen Iverson and the Eagles with McNabb, they can't say that. And I think it does soften the stance a little bit. But I think after a while, when there's a little bit of a drought and the team doesn't win again, then things start rearing their ugly head. Right after the Phillies won the World Series, they went back the next year and lost, and then 7 months later, the Flyers lost the Stanley Cup.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I was out there on Sunday night out in Philadelphia. My nephew lives on South Street, and I watched the game with him and my son. And after we won, we walked down South Street and up to Broad and walked towards City Hall. And yeah, there were some knuckleheads, but just to see the happiness, the sheer joy on everybody's face, you knew that all those people that were out there had invested so much of themselves in the team that you really felt happy for them. And I could say with confidence that this Eagles team like the 1980 Phillies team, none of those guys will ever have to buy a meal or a drink in a bar or a restaurant again. I mean,
Never.
That is how much they will be loved and honored in this town. And you win another Super Bowl or a couple other Super Bowls, dare I say,
forget it.
dynasty. Well, those players will be gods. The core
you get bronze statues.
That's right. Will be gods.
Yeah.
So, it's just it's the double-edged sword of that passion. When it's negative, it's horrific. When it's positive, it's
you don't want to be anywhere else as an athlete.
You don't.
Yeah.
You don't.
No.
And I have noticed that. I mean, have noticed that about particularly the Eagles, and it's why it's kind of almost like saying in my case, if you can't beat them, which means if you can't get everybody to love baseball as much as I do, then join them. I admit, I mean, I am sold on this team, and you can see in the few times they lost that there was a pall over the city. I mean, it could be sunny, but people are just not happy because the Eagles lost. And that
you can identify the city. You can identify the city on a Monday morning in the fall, whether the Eagles won or lost.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I got one more question for you, Joe. If Philly is such a bad place to play as a pro athlete, as, the national media casts us, then why do so many of those former athletes live here after they retire?
That's a really interesting question, Bill. And Roynell Young is the only Philadelphia athlete who had some success in this town and then say later on that they didn't want to stay in Philly because everybody knew him well. Now he runs youth organizations in Houston, and he wanted to create his own identity and things of that nature. Roynell Young, it's actually a good trivia question. He's one of only two Eagles to play in the Super Bowl against the Raiders and the Frog Bowl in 1988. That being said, to me, and I noticed this now, and it really came to me, I guess after the Eagles won, it seems to me that more old school players are the ones that end up staying in the area, and there's a lot of them. Broad Street Bullies, Eagles, Phillies, not a whole lot of Sixers. World Be Free, I'm not sure if Aaron McKee is still in the area now, who end up staying. Back in the day, players made a pittance compared to today's salaries. Meanwhile, the Broad Street Bullies, they can still make decent money appearing at events and signings, and why not leverage your fame? Most of the players could go back home to Canada where they're from, but why blend in with the population there when you're considered a legend in Philadelphia and you can do whatever you want and probably make a decent salary and provide for your family by doing public appearances and doing autograph signings? With the money athletes make these days, I think you're going to see this less and less as time goes on. I don't think it has anything to do with the city in general. What's really going to be interesting is the Eagles situation, new and old players. Because with the Eagles, like you said, there was no barometer before. The last team was in 1960, and most of those players have passed on, Tom Brookshire, Chuck Bednarik. But now there is a barometer, the first Super Bowl team ever. The Flyers have been able, in my opinion, to do so well around here, Bill, whether it's, I don't know, the financial figures that they make in general, but just having a career or being a spokesperson, because honestly, nobody has won since they've won. And that's the barometer that people still look at. They still talk about 1974 and 1975 because no one else has won since then. They've been to 6 Stanley Cups, but nobody's won. And so to answer your question, I think they can leverage their fame and they're recognizable. And they like the area too. Larry Boa, when I interviewed him about that question in the book, he just said he loves the area. He's been here since the early 1970s. He likes the change of seasons. He's a California guy originally. But, a lot of the players, and particularly, like I said, the Flyers come to mind. And, why not stay in a place where you're loved and revered, and you can make some decent money as well? Mm-hmm. Makes sense to me.
Yeah, I do see that. I understand what you're saying about now the more modern era of player. Chase Utley lives around here, makes his year-round home here. Raul
Oh, I thought he had moved.
Ibanez.
I thought he moved to San Francisco.
No, I believe that he still lives around Gladwin. That he has a house there, and Raul Ibanez lives out in Chester County somewhere. So, there are people who have gone on to other teams. I think Cole Hamill still, lives around Westchester. So they do have, now I might be wrong, maybe in the last year or so they've moved, but, these were players that, did stay on. So it'll be interesting to see. And I do see, even though, Mike Schmidt has moved on, more and more he's coming back. I mean, it's nice to see him around the ballpark, particularly on the weekends. And who knows, maybe he will come back too. I can't speak for the other organizations. Obviously, I know the Phillies, more than the others, but I hope we do see a lot of players, especially from the 2008 Phillies. Actually, the 93 Phillies, there are a number of 93 Phillies that still live around here. We'll see. Well, listen, Joe, thanks for being with us and writing such a wonderful book. I mean, I really, really enjoyed it. I really got an inside view on Philly fans, and especially the chapter on the boos was my favorite as well.
Oh, good.
but thank you. And
thank you, Bill. Thank you so much. Appreciate this. And I've been a fan of your work for a long time, so it was great to finally meet you the other month and to do this. I definitely be interested in doing this again. It was a lot of fun.
Well, I offer you, Joe, my sincerest sympathies that you are a fan of my work, but
don't sell yourself short, Bill.
I guess I thank you too. Listeners, the title of the book is A Snowball's Chance. Billy Fires Back Against the National Media. And the lead author is Joe Vallee, who's been my guest. And, Joe, you could pick this up on Amazon.com. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is BillKashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.